The fort was supposed to hold. It sat high on the rocky heights of northern Manhattan, its guns pointed down at the Hudson, and men who built it believed it could turn back an army. On the morning of November 16, 1776, that belief was about to be tested. Thousands of British regulars and Hessian mercenaries were climbing the slopes through the trees with bayonets fixed, and the small American garrison had nowhere to run. On a ridge near the northern wall stood a single cannon. Beside it stood a man named John Corbin, and close enough to touch the barrel stood his wife. Her name was Margaret. In the next few hours, she would take her dying husband's place at the gun, and she would keep firing into the enemy until her own body was torn apart. This is the true story of Margaret Corbin, the first woman in American history to be granted a pension for her military service. Margaret Cochran was born on November 12, 1751, on the Pennsylvania frontier in what is now known as Franklin County. Her family was of Irish descent, part of the wave of hardy immigrants who pushed west to farm the dangerous edge of the colonies. Life out there was lean and exposed. There were no walls around most homesteads, and no soldiers nearby, and little stood between a family and the violence that came with a contested border. That violence found the Cochrans in 1756, when Margaret was only 5 years old. The French and Indian War was raging, and frontier settlements across Pennsylvania were being raided again and again. One of these raids struck her family's farm. Her father was killed. Her mother was carried off. Margaret and her brother survived only because they happened to be away from the house when the attack came. Orphaned before she was old enough to hold much memory of her parents, she was taken by an uncle who raised her through a hard childhood on that same frontier. She grew into a tall, strong, plain-spoken woman. By the accounts of those who later knew her, she stood close to 5 feet 8 inches, unusually tall for that time, with a blunt manner and no patience for softness. The frontier had not been gentle with her, and she did not pretend otherwise. In 1772, at the age of 21, Margaret married a Virginia farmer named John Corbin. For a few years they worked a small piece of Pennsylvania land and lived the quiet life of a young farming couple. However, it did not last. In 1775, the War for Independence broke out at Lexington and Concord, and Pennsylvania began raising men for the Continental cause. John enlisted in the 1st Company of Pennsylvania Artillery. He served as a matros, one of the crewmen who loaded, sponged, and helped fire the heavy guns. Margaret now faced the choice that thousands of soldiers' wives faced. She could stay behind on the farm, alone and vulnerable, with no family to fall back on, or she could follow the army she chose to follow. She became what the army called a camp follower. These were the wives, widows, and children who traveled with the troops, cooking their meals and washing their clothes, nursing the sick and the wounded. And it was most unglamorous and exhausting work. Margaret was not one to fade into the background. She was gruff, loud, and comfortable among the men. She smoked a tobacco pipe. She talked like a soldier. She spent time around the cannon crews rather than with other women. By the autumn of 1776, the war broke out around New York and was going badly for Americans. Washington's army had been beaten and pushed north. After the Battle of White Plains in late October, General Washington began pulling his forces across the Hudson into New Jersey. That left Fort Washington. Perched on high ground of Upper Manhattan, it was the last American position on the island. Washington wanted it abandoned, but the officer in command, Colonel Robert Magaw, believed it could be held, and the garrison stayed. Roughly 2,800 Americans, including John Corbin's artillery company, waited behind its walls. On the morning of November 16th, the attack came from several directions at once. A far larger force of British regulars and Hessian mercenaries closed in on the outnumbered defenders and ground its way up the rocky slopes. John Corbin's gun was posted on a ridge to the north, part of a thin line of cannon trying to slow the Hessian advance. Margaret was there at his side. As the fighting opened, she carried water up to the gun, the water used to swab the hot barrel between shots so the next charge of powder would not ignite too soon. She moved back and forth through the noise and the smoke while the crew loaded and fired as fast as they could. Then the man serving alongside John was hit, and moments later John Corbin himself was struck and killed at his post. However, Margaret did not run. She had watched her husband work that gun for months, and she knew exactly what to do. She stepped into his place and took over, loading and aiming, firing the cannon into the oncoming enemy. Soldiers who saw her spoke afterwards of her steady hand and her accurate fire. But a gun that keeps firing draws attention. The enemy artillery found her position and turned on it. A blast of grape shot tore into her, ripping her shoulder and nearly severing her left arm, mangling her chest and cutting her jaw. She went down beside the cannon she had refused to abandon. The defense could not hold. Fort Washington fell within hours. The British captured some 2,800 men along a great store of cannon, powder, and supplies. It was the worst American defeat of the entire war, and Washington watched it unfold from across the river in New Jersey, unable to stop it. Margaret survived, but only barely. British doctors treated her wounds and saved her life. Because she was counted among the wounded, she was released on parole with other prisoners and returned to the American side. The journey nearly finished what the grape shot had started. She was ferried across the Hudson to Fort Lee in New Jersey, then hauled roughly 90 miles by wagon over rough roads to a military hospital in Philadelphia. She lay there for months, recovering slowly and only in part. However, she would never truly heal. Her left arm was ruined, and she lost the use of it for the rest of her life. Simple things like dressing or feeding herself became difficult or impossible. She was a widow with no family, no husband's protection, and a body that could no longer earn her living. She had nearly given everything at Fort Washington, and she was left with almost nothing. For a time, Margaret slipped through the cracks. Then, in 1779, the officers and soldiers who remembered what she had done began to speak up for her, and their accounts reached people with the power to help. On June 29, 1779, the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania granted her $30 to cover her immediate needs and forwarded her cause to the Continental Congress Board of War. The board was moved by her story and her suffering. On July 6, 1779, Congress acted. In recognition of the woman who, quote, was wounded and disabled in the attack on Fort Washington, whilst she heroically filled the post of her husband, who was killed by her side, they awarded Margaret Corbin a lifelong pension of 1/2 the monthly pay of a soldier, along with a full set of clothes or its value in cash. It was a landmark moment. Even if the country barely noticed, for the first time in American history, the government formally recognized a woman as a disabled combat veteran and placed her on the rolls to be paid for her service. She was the first woman to receive a military pension in the United States. The recognition, like everything else in her life, came with hard edges. Her pension was only half of that of a wounded man. There were small acts of respect, too. When some questioned whether a woman could draw a soldier's rum ration, one of Washington's aides settled the matter plainly. Margaret was a pensioner of Congress, and she was entitled to it. She was later granted a clothing allowance as well. Because she was now carried on military rolls, Margaret was enrolled in the Invalid Corps, a unit made up of soldiers too injured to march or fight, but still kept in service to guard hospitals, stores, and posts. It was a place for men that the war had used up. Margaret, too crippled to do much of anything, was housed there, fed, clothed, and cared for as one of them. In 1781, the Corps of Invalids became a part of the garrison at West Point on the Hudson, and Margaret moved with it. She remained there as a disabled pensioner, under the charge of post officers, long after the fighting stopped. When the Corps was disbanded in 1783, she was discharged from the army, but she stayed on in the Hudson Highlands. She had nowhere else to go. Her final years were bitter. The pains from her wounds never left her, and it made her hard to be around. She could be coarse and quarrelsome, and she clashed with those tasked with her care. One officer at a loss wrote to the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, that she was so offensive of a person that no one was willing to talk change of her. Knox, who had once commanded the Continental Artillery she served in, saw to it that she was provided with help. She was looked after in her last years, what is now Highland Falls, New York. Margaret Corbin died there in January of 1800, not yet 50 years old, worn down by the wounds she had carried for nearly a quarter of a century. For more than 100 years, the woman who took her husband's gun at Fort Washington was all but forgotten. She was buried in an obscure grave along the Hudson, unmarked and unremembered, her story fading into the footnotes of the Revolution. Then, in 1926, the Daughters of the American Revolution set out to give her back her name. Working through the papers of General Henry Knox, they verified her record and her service, located what they believed was her grave, and had her remains moved to the cemetery at the United States Military Academy at West Point. There she was reburied with full military honors, one of the very few women ever laid to rest among the soldiers of that hallowed ground beneath the monument raised in her memory. But the story has one last strange turn. In recent years, a forensic study of the grave revealed that the remains moved to West Point in 1926 were not Margaret's at all, but those of an unknown man. The true resting place of Captain Molly is, for now, lost. The Daughters of the American Revolution have since taken up the search again, determined to find her grave and give her the burial she deserves. It is a fitting mystery for a woman who fought so bravely. Margaret Corbin was not a general or a statesman. She was a frontier orphan who became a soldier's wife, then a camp follower with a soldier's blunt tongue. But on one terrible morning, she stood at a cannon while an army came up the hill, and she refused to leave it. For that, she became the first of her kind, and whether or not we will ever find her grave, we will not lose her name again. If you enjoyed this deep dive into American history told in story form, consider subscribing for more narratives where we peel back the smoke of time and see what still waves in the dawn's early light.